Words Set Me Free, the story of young Frederick Douglass. My mama was named Harriet Bailey. They say my master, Captain Aaron Anthony, was my daddy. After I was born, they sent me to my grandmama and my mama to another plantation. But when she could, she'd walk the 12 miles in the middle of the night to come and see me. It must have been a long walk, because by the time she got there, she was too tired to talk. I remember she would just sit on the dirt floor near my pallet, watching me. I never saw her face in the light of day. In the morning she'd be gone. Sometimes I wondered if I had only dreamed she was by my side, her rough hands gently stroking my face. When I was still young, Cook told me my mama took sick. I never saw her again. I lived with my Grandma Betsy in her cabin until our master told her to bring me up to the big house on what we called Great House Farm. Grandmama went back to her cabin, but I stayed behind with the other slave children. I was just 6 years old. Much of my time was my own, as I was not yet old enough to work the fields. We ate our 2 meals a day out of a trough, just like the animals in the barn. We were always hungry, so we shoved down our meals of cornmeal mush with shells and dirty hands. But even the animals were rested in the heat of the afternoon sun, and they were never whipped bloody for being too tired or too sick or too slow. At 8 years old, my mistress told me I was leaving the plantation to go to another master, her brother-in-law in Baltimore. Master rented me out to make extra money. I could not imagine a life beyond my plantation. From Cousin Tom, an older slave on the plantation who had once been to Baltimore, he told me of a city so big and pretty it seemed like 1,000 great house farms. On a Saturday, when we sailed down the Miles River with all I owned in the world, my first pair of scratchy breeches and a shift, I did not cry. I was ready to leave Talbot County, Maryland, behind. We arrived at Smith's Wharf on Sunday morning. Old Tom never told me that Baltimore looked as if it floated on a sea of waves. At the Ellicana Street home of my new master, Hugh Auld, his wife, Sophia, opened the door and greeted me. Mrs. was small, not much bigger than me, and she had the first friendly white face I had ever seen. It took us a while to get used to each other. She had never owned slaves, and I had never been treated like a paid servant. I was glad no one ever told her that there is a big difference between a servant you pay and a slave you own. During the day, I ran errands for my master. In the evening, Mrs. sat by the fire and read her Bible aloud. Her kindly smile and voice warmed me as I entered the room. I do not know why, but I asked her to teach me to read. On that night, she took me directly into her library, pulled out the first book she saw, and sat me down next to her. We started with the letter A, and she continued from there. The letters felt strange on my lips. As I read, I remembered hearing of a boy back on the plantation who had his thumb chopped off when he was caught reading, and the letters I was reciting got caught in my throat. I remembered my old master's words when he gathered all his slaves together to announce anyone caught trying to read will be whipped, and my mouth was dry. Every day she gave me more letters to learn, until I knew I had the whole alphabet and a few words memorized. She promised me that soon I would be able to read the Bible on my own. I wanted to read for myself where in the Bible it said one man should own another. But before that could happen, he found out. I couldn't blame her. Mrs. was so proud she had taught me all of my letters in such a short time that she told her husband so. I thought he was going to whip me right there, but his words hurt worse than any lashing. He should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do, he shouted, and my mistress looked away ashamed. If you teach him how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. I may not have known how to read, but I knew that if learning made me no longer want to be a slave, then I would secure my freedom one letter at a time. She locked the door to the library and hid away the newspapers. She watched me all the time to make sure I was not putting together any more of those letters she had taught me. I knew she wished she could take it all back, but it was too late. With a brick and a lump of chalk was first how I practiced my letters. Scratched them all along the brick streets and wooden fences of Baltimore. P looked like a sail on one of the ships. I was a leg with a big foot, where L was a leg with a big foot. 2 sticks crossed in the middle. That was an X. There was plenty of food in Master Ald's house, food enough to share. I started bringing along some bread in case some of the white children from the neighborhood needed some convincing. They did not have much, so for just a piece of bread I dared them to write letters better than me. What they wrote, I copied. I told them my name. "Let me see you try it," I said. Fast as I could, I ran to complete all my errands for my missus. Then me and my new friends would get to work on my writing. Rolled in the seat of my breeches was where I kept my copybook. Mine now that I took it from Master's son, Thomas. Even though he was only 6, Mrs. said he learned his letters a year ago. He was reading now. While I ran through the wharves and narrow streets of Baltimore, I was reading. The words the ship carpenters scribbled on timbers en masse, the names of shops and streets, headlines from the newspapers held in a newsboy's hand. I kept all those words in my head and copied them into my book when I got a chance. As I ran, I could almost feel myself free, running to a home where no man called himself a master of another. Sometimes, before I returned, I stood on the docks watching the ships, free to go as they pleased. At 12 years old, with tips I saved for my errands, I bought my first newspaper and learned new words: liberty, justice, and freedom. Abolition was the word the newspapers used when they called for ending slavery. These were the words my master would never want me to see. Now that I was reading about Negroes in the North, free from the burden of slavery, it was as if someone had lit a candle to my world. I saw freedom everywhere I looked, and the hope of it was what kept me alive. For 7 years I worked for my master and his missus down at the shipyard, lifting and laboring, and back at their house, toting and hauling, always pretending to be something I was not, content to be a slave. When my old master, Captain Anthony, died, I had to return to Great House Farm to be divided up with the rest of his property, along with the sheep, the horses, and the swine. Great House Farm remained the same. Hunger, weariness, and sadness seeped into the souls of every slave. The boy who returned to his birthplace was not the same one who had left years earlier. That young boy was replaced with a 15-year-old who was free on the inside, but not yet free on the outside. Though my copybooks and newspapers were long gone, words comforted me in the fields as I chopped cotton from sunup to sundown, and words lay down with me at night when my body ached with pain and hunger. I knew that the words would put an end to my suffering. I just wasn't sure when and how. I was hired out to work for Mr. William Friedland, and while he was kinder than most, he was still a man who believed it was his divine right to own another human being. Since my return to Talbot County, I became friends with Henry, John, and Handy, and I often spoke of my years in Baltimore. When I first told them I'd learned to read, they stopped short and looked around to see if anyone else was nearby. They asked me to teach them. I did. That's how I knew I could trust them. From then on, I thought I would devote my Sundays to teaching these, my loved fellow slaves, how to read. At first, we had school among the trees, me scratching out letters and words in the dirt with a stick. John caught on fast, and he helped me teach the others. They never missed a Sunday. Sometimes they brought others who then brought others. We had a school before long, but as far as the master knew, we were having church. Sitting on rocks and stumps and tired from the week's work, we sang out the alphabet like we sang our spirituals. Those of us who could read from the Bible. We were doing God's work. During one of our services, I got the idea for how I could run. Someone mentioned they knew where Master kept his paper and quills, and did I think we could use them? At first I said no, we needed nothing from Master, but then I started thinking. First I approached John, and then 3 others decided to join us in our escape. We would steal a boat from the neighboring Hamilton farm and make our way in the night on the Chesapeake Bay. From there we would follow the North Star. 8 years had passed since I sat in the library of Mrs. Auld learning my letters, and 8 years still since Master Auld had issued the warning to his wife. It was the only time in my life when I agreed with my master. I was now unfit to be a slave. Just before Easter, with a fine quill and paper secured by one of the house slaves, I wrote in a firm and steady hand, "This is to certify that I, the undersigned, to have given the bearer, my servant, Frederick Bailey, full liberty to go to Baltimore to spend the Easter holiday. Written with mine own hand, 1835, William Hamilton, near St. Michael's in Talbot County, Maryland." I always knew that somehow words would set me free, but words on paper were now going to let me walk right out of Talbot County and into freedom up north. Author's note: Frederick Bailey did not escape that evening. An informant revealed their plot to the master, and all members in the party were jailed. Before he was taken away, Frederick managed to throw away his pass and instructed his friends to swallow the passes he had written for them, whispering, "Own nothing." After a week in prison, and fearing he'd be killed if he stayed in the area, he was freed by his master and returned to Hugh Auld in Baltimore. 3 years later, on September 3, 1838, Frederick, with the help of conductors on the Underground Railroad, successfully escaped to New York, where he changed his name to Frederick Douglass. He, with his wife, Anna Murray, like most slaves, Frederick never knew his actual birth date, but when he was 17 years old, his master estimated it to be February 1818. In 1841, he was to speak at an anti-slavery meeting, and he became a lecturer on the abolition of slavery. In 1845, he wrote and published his first book, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, which described the evils of slavery, and it immediately became a bestseller. 2 years later, he began an abolitionist newspaper, the North Star.